You're standing in a valley somewhere in what we'd now call Central Asia, maybe 30,000 years ago. The air is sharp with coming winter. You can taste it. Your legs ache in a way that has become permanent, a dull throb that reminds you every time you move that your body is no longer what it was. The tribe is preparing to migrate to higher ground, following the herds. Your daughter keeps looking at you, then looking away. Not with cruelty exactly, but with something closer to calculation. You're 60, which in that world might mean you've lived longer than anyone else she's ever known. The math is becoming difficult to ignore. You eat more. You move slower. You need more help when the snow comes. And there are mouths to feed. Here's what we're told about ancient peoples and aging. Elders were revered. They held wisdom. Societies protected them, honored them, made sure they had respected places by the fire. We like this story because it suggests something noble about how humans have always worked. It feels right. But that's almost certainly not what happened, or at least not the whole story. The reality was far stranger, more complicated, and more revealing about how we actually think about people who stop being productive. The truth about aging in pre-industrial societies isn't that it was uniformly brutal or uniformly kind. It's that it was conditional. And that conditionality tells us something we'd rather not think too hard about. How much of human dignity has always been tied to utility, and how many elaborate psychological and spiritual systems we've built specifically to make peace with that fact. Let's start with what we actually know, which is less than you think. Archaeological evidence of aging and disability in ancient populations is sparse but revealing. We find skeletons with severe arthritis, bone infections that would have caused constant pain, healed fractures that never set properly. Some of these individuals lived for years or decades despite injuries that should have killed them. The fact that they survived at all tells us something. Someone was keeping them alive. In a subsistence economy where every resource matters, keeping a person who can't hunt or gather requires deliberate choice. The Shanidar Cave in Iraq gives us one of the most striking examples. The remains of an older male Neanderthal, call him an elder, show evidence of injuries so severe he would have been nearly immobilized for much of his life. A badly healed arm, scarring on his ribs, damage to his legs. By all logic, he should have been abandoned. Instead, he lived, and the wear patterns on his teeth suggest he was fed soft food, likely by others in his group. He was kept alive despite being useless by economic standards. The question is why, and the answer gets uncomfortable because it requires us to think about what ancient people valued in ways that don't fit our modern categories. Some anthropologists argue these were special cases, shamans, or individuals with particular spiritual status that justified the investment. Others suggest that caring for the severely disabled was common enough to be unremarkable. But here's the thing most people miss. These explanations assume ancient societies thought categorically about who deserved to live. They didn't. They thought practically and locally. Your father lived or died because of immediate circumstances, family bonds, and what your group could afford that season, not because of doctrine. The second part of this equation is the transition itself. Aging wasn't a gradual process in the way we experience it now. Your utility changed dramatically at a specific point. You stopped hunting. You stopped moving at the pace the group required. You became a liability in times of scarcity, a potential liability. And here's where the psychological architecture became important. Different cultures developed different responses to this threshold. Some intensified religious roles for elders. Some shifted them toward storytelling and knowledge transmission. Some moved them gradually toward spiritual preparation for death. All of these serve a similar function. They transform the aging person from a liability into a different kind of resource, or at least into someone whose life has ongoing meaning. The Inuit cultures practiced what observers called voluntary abandonment, where elderly people would leave the group to die in harsh conditions, often framed as a choice. But the language matters here. Was it truly voluntary? Or was it a response to social pressure, to an understanding that your presence endangered the group's survival? The psychological environment had been constructed so that the choice felt inevitable. The elderly person wasn't being forced. They were being positioned to understand that their death was the generous thing, the heroic thing. The ritual was made noble precisely because the situation wasn't. Other cultures embedded elders into knowledge systems. The Aboriginal Australian cultures, for instance, associated aging with spiritual advancement and connection to country and law. As your body declined, your role didn't disappear. It transformed upward toward the sacred. You became more important in some ways. But here's the crucial thing. This wasn't because everyone suddenly became nice or ethical. It was because these societies had constructed an economy where accumulated knowledge and ritual function had genuine exchange value. An older person's memory was literally worth the resources it took to keep them alive. This connects to something deeper about how humans rationalize difficult truths. When aging made you a potential burden, cultures developed narratives that made your continued existence meaningful in non-economic terms. You mattered because you were wise. You mattered because you were sacred. You mattered because your death was an act of sacrifice. The specifics varied wildly, but the underlying function was identical: create meaning that compensates for lost utility. It's not that ancient peoples were uniquely brutal or uniquely kind. They just had fewer pretenses about what they were doing. Consider the care asymmetry that appears across cultures. Young people with disabilities were much more likely to be kept alive than older people with equivalent disabilities. Why? Because a young person had potential. They could develop other skills, other uses. They could have children. They could accumulate status through means other than production. An older person with a disability had a different calculus. What's the return on investment? In many traditional societies, the answer was brutal and clear. But here's what's fascinating and easily missed. The cultures that survived, the ones that maintained stability and cohesion over centuries, weren't the ones that were most efficient at disposing of unproductive members. They were often the ones that had constructed the most elaborate systems of meaning around aging and elderhood. The cultures that survived weren't necessarily more kind. They were more psychologically sophisticated. They had built frameworks that allowed people to accept their own decline as meaningful rather than simply as loss. But here's what connects all these variations. Aging was a problem that had to be managed, either through material support or through psychological frameworks or through both. And the psychological frameworks that persisted were the ones that created meaning from something that circumstances had made difficult. The wisdom of elders mattered because elders needed to matter. The spiritual advancement of age was elevated because age had to be elevated to something beyond simple decline. What does this tell us about ourselves? Well, if we're honest, we're not so different. We've just shifted which dimensions of human value we emphasize. We don't entirely abandon people who become unproductive in material terms. We've built enough material surplus that we don't have to. But we do experience a version of that same anxiety about how to justify the existence of people who are no longer economically productive. And we do construct frameworks of meaning around aging that feel surprisingly familiar if you step back far enough. We tell stories about the wisdom of elders. We emphasize the psychological value of grandparenting. We talk about the spiritual progress of aging. None of this is new. None of it is wrong. But we should recognize it for what it is: a continuation of what humans have always done when circumstances put certain people at structural disadvantage. We create meaning that compensates. We build narratives that transform burden into purpose. The real insight isn't that ancient peoples were brutally utilitarian, while we're enlightened. It's that we're doing basically the same thing they were, just with more resources and different rhetoric. We've externalized the problem through wealth and technology, but the underlying anxiety about the relationship between productivity and value, between utility and dignity, never really disappeared. It just got more sophisticated. This brings us to the harder question, the one that actually matters. Why did humans everywhere do this? Why not just let nature take its course? Partly it was probably accident and circumstance. Some groups abandoned elders, some didn't, and both approaches had enough survival advantage that neither completely dominated. But there's another factor that's harder to measure. Humans seem deeply opposed to making that decision explicit. Even in societies we know practice what we call abandonment, they narrativized it. They gave it meaning. They created rituals. They told stories that made it something other than what it was. This suggests something about human psychology that we're still somewhat resistant to acknowledging. We need to believe that our treatment of others is justified by something higher than pure utility. When circumstances force us into decisions that violate that need, we immediately generate frameworks that feel more palatable. This isn't unique to ancient peoples. This is what we do. This is what humans do. Now, before we go further, there's something important to acknowledge here. I'm describing broad patterns, but cultures varied enormously. Some societies did genuinely prioritize elder care. Some did develop systems where aging carried increasing status and responsibility. The Confucian traditions of East Asia, for instance, explicitly elevated elder authority within family structures in ways that had real material consequences. These weren't simple stories. And we should be careful not to slide into the assumption that everything was secretly grim and utilitarian underneath. The meaning people created around aging might have been constructed partly by necessity, but that doesn't make it less real or less important to those living within it. But what's true across nearly all pre-industrial societies is that the transition into frailty and dependence created a genuine structural problem. You stop being able to contribute in the ways that the group required. In a subsistence economy, that's not abstract. That's real. And the philosophical and spiritual frameworks developed to manage that transition are, in effect, technologies for psychological survival. They allowed aging people to accept their diminishment. They allowed younger people to justify the resources invested in caring for them. They allowed societies to function despite the increasing incompatibility between people's productive capacity and their basic need for resources. The counterargument here is crucial, though, and it's often overlooked. We shouldn't assume that being unproductive was as stigmatized in small communities as it would become in larger ones. In a group of 30 people, you might be unable to hunt, but you could still be a person who people loved, who had specific relationships, who occupied a meaningful role. You didn't need an entire ideological framework to justify your existence if you were someone's mother or father. The meaning was already there. The problem arose at scale, or in scarcity conditions where love and kinship couldn't quite override the basic math of survival. Similarly, we have evidence that many societies did invest significantly in elder care even when it was economically difficult. The resources spent on caring for disabled individuals in many ancient communities suggest something other than pure calculation. Maybe it was genuine kinship attachment. Maybe it was reciprocal obligation. You cared for your parents because you expected your children to care for you. Maybe it was cultural values that we're only partially capturing in the archaeological record. The reality was probably all of these things in different proportions depending on the group and the season. The dark secret of how ancient humans dealt with aging is that they didn't really solve it. They worked around it. They built psychological structures that made the unsolvable more bearable. And every culture that survived long enough to become the ancestors of people like us had to become genuinely excellent at this particular form of meaning-making. You had to construct narratives that made aging something other than simple decline. You had to position elders in ways that felt meaningful even when they couldn't contribute to survival in the ways the group required. You had to make a logical problem into a spiritual one. which is exactly what we do now, by the way. We just don't think of it that way because we have money and healthcare and comfort to show for it. But the core problem, how to maintain human dignity in the face of structural irrelevance, is the same one. And our solutions, for all their sophistication, rest on the same basic foundation. We tell stories about why older people matter. We assign them meaning. We build rituals around their transition. We create frameworks that transform the asymmetry of care into something that feels like reciprocal respect. You can judge whether that's cynical or whether it's deeply, essentially human. Probably it's both. But if you want to understand anything about why we organize aging the way we do now, why we move elderly people into institutions, why we talk about active aging, why we're so obsessed with older people staying relevant, you have to start by acknowledging that we're not working from some newfound ethical framework. We're continuing something that humans have always done. We're just doing it with different tools and different narratives. And the narratives matter. They matter because they're what make the situation bearable for everyone involved. Meaning is what transforms an economic problem into something that feels like humanity.